Oh, hey there. Come on in. Welcome back to the studio. Hey, the lights are on, the paint's wet, and the coffee, as always, has just been brewed. This is the painting I was going to do for you today. It's called The Storyteller. It's a portrait of John Coleman, the sculptor. But unfortunately, iMovie had other ideas. So this is the painting I'm going to do for you today. It's of a group of Arizona Rangers that were together for a short while, and I call this painting Make the First One Count. A few years back, I did a photo shoot with these gentlemen here, and they are reenactors and dress like the Arizona Rangers that were together for a short time. These are the three gentlemen that I'll be painting today. The other two, Tom and Martine, I've painted before, but I've not painted these three. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. Here's the photo from the photo shoot that I took, and I'm going to be working from this one today. I took a lot of photos, so I've got multiple paintings that I can do from this shoot. But once I get the drawing done and transferred down onto my Arches 140-pound 300 GSM paper, I pick out which brushes I might use. Most of them I've used on this one, but not all of them. I'll put the original photo kind of down there in the left-hand side, but I've decided I want to make this painting a little more saturated and more towards the golden hour. So I am making the sky more purpley and pink. And also I've kind of moved one of the trees. Well, I've moved quite a few things around so that it works better as a painting, but there's kind of a bush or a tree that I've decided to put behind the main guy's head, the shooter's head, because it's going to help me to show that there's smoke coming out of the rifle. Having a dark shape back there is really going to help out. So I'm starting by doing the sky, and then I did just a little bit of the rock formation off to the left-hand side there, just to get started, get the feel, see how the paper was working for me. Once I felt like, okay, I understand what the paper's doing, I went ahead and started putting in that bush or the tree that's behind the shooter's head there. When I work in watercolor, I start lighter and then I go dark. And so you'll see that as I'm working here, maybe things are a little bit weaker, but then I'll go back in and punch it up with some warms and cools so that your eye feels like there's real dimension going on in there, and color temperature shifts help whenever your viewer looks at a painting to make it feel like it's more of an advanced technique. And if you are painting and you put in warms and cools into, let's say, a tree, it's going to read much better. A little tip, though, is when you do that, you need to make sure that the values are close to one another, the same tone, the same light or darkness. That way things are going to look like they're supposed to be together. I really could have started anywhere on the painting, but for some reason, I felt like starting with the foliage would make it a little bit easier. So once I got some of that in, I went ahead and spattered in some of the masking fluid so that when I did apply color to the rocks, there would be some built-in texture there. And went in with a little paintbrush, put in a few strategic areas or dots, spots of masking fluid, let it dry completely, and then using the side of my brush, I went ahead and started putting in some of the back trees there. Starting light, I could have masked that gun off, but I guess I decided I didn't feel like doing that. So what can I say? Some days you just feel like taking a shortcut, and some days you get away with it. But here's a little warm and cool area. Oh, uh-oh. Must have been some color on my brush, and it got smeared or... Yeah, oh boy. Yeah, that's not going to come up. Well, we'll just turn that into a branch, something like that. It'll work out. So I continue to break those shapes up a little bit. And once I get that laid in, then it's time to do the fun parts. I've been really looking forward to doing this rock. And like when you're working on the trees, you let the brush do the work for you, and you can add a lot of texture by using the side of your brush. Starting with putting in kind of an orangey base, and then I'll work in some different colors along the way. You'll see I've got yellows in there and reds and some greens. The great thing about these rocks is that there's a lot of lichen on them, and so there's quite a bit of green that will show through, and that just kind of helps to tie the colors into what's going on around with the the trees. And watercolor just happens to be one of those mediums that you can play around with color a little bit more than, say, with oil paints. And so I'll put my base orange down, and then you see there that I've put some green in there. Very similar value, but you break that up, and it looks like you've got a lot more detail going on in there than what you really do. And it just feels better to have color variation. If I was to do this all in one color, it would just be so boring to look at. So now it's time to pick up the masking fluid. I like to use a rubber cement pickup, but you can use your fingers to do it. Doesn't really matter, whatever works for you. So as I put in the shadows, when you go from a light area to a shadow area, the transition point usually is a lot more vibrant in color. I like to make sure that at that turning point, I make sure that I have that extra color in there, because it really sells the idea that that this rock is turning. Just continue working, adding in the variations of colors. This is such a large area, you really need to have that color difference going on. Now, I love using the side of my brush, or I'll take a mop brush like this and I'll splay it out so that you actually get the brush doing the work for you. This really sells the feeling that these trees that we have around here, they've got pretty wispy leaves. I think this was in the spring anyways, and so everything wasn't completely leafed out yet. But even if it was, a lot of times you see kind of feathery leaves. The leaves are small. And so using the side of your brush is going to help you to get that wispy feeling, but at the same time, you're not going to get the feeling that you're noodling it, that somebody went in there and put in every tiny little leaf. To me, that's not the beauty of watercolor. For my eye, I don't like to see that. I want it to look like someone went in there and it didn't take them very long at all to get that tree in. I want to marvel at the fact that there's hardly anything there, but it looks like it's there. Here's a little tip for you. I'm using a dagger brush that I used to use back in the days when I was doing the faux painting. I did that for a little while, did our whole house back in Minnesota, and this is left over from that. And so I pulled it out and I wanted to see how it would work. And I like it. You can get a very sharp line, and you can also use the side of the brush, and it like this here, and it makes it feel like there's a randomness to the shadow side of these leaves, and rather than going in and painting everything. Trying to make something look like that never works for me, and so I like to have the brush kind of squiggle in there. Now it's on to getting these figures started. If you put something down like I did here, and you don't like the way it went down first, blot it off. Give yourself a second, third, fourth try until you feel like it's right. Don't just say, well, it's watercolor, you can't fix it once it's down. Well, that's true once it's dry. And even that's not true, because I like using gouache. And so I'm basically, on this guy, I'm putting in the shadow side, not super dark, but dark enough that I know that this is where the shadows are. And then into the light side, I'll work the colors and then let some of that color blend into the shadows. Now, I'll show you what I mean here in just a moment, once I get this shadow side put in. So now when I get to the face, this is where I slow down. I really look at the reference. I want to make sure that I'm as accurate as I can be, still using a decent sized brush. But the thing about doing faces, whether you're doing it in oil painting or watercolor, you need to get it looking good, because faces are one thing that's kind of polarizing when it comes to photos or paintings. If you don't get it right, you can have a terrific painting, but if that face doesn't work, that painting is not going to sell. So take your time, get it right. I start adding a little bit of the color in here. Now these guys, they're supposed to be outside all the time, and so I make sure that they're good and tan. And since it's a little bit later in the day and the sun is starting to go down, their skin color is going to be more saturated anyways. And so I pull some of that warmer color up into the shadow area so that they don't feel completely separated. You have to feel like the actual local color, his skin tone, is influencing the color of what his face looks like in the shadows. And so it needs to have a little warmth in there. Also, I just softened the back edge of the shadow area of the face because I didn't want it to look like it was cut out. It needs to kind of blend into the background, and that's a nice way to do that, is to take and soften that edge back there. Don't be afraid to let that blend out a little bit. Well, like I do on a lot of these videos, let's learn a little bit about what I'm painting here, since a lot of my subjects are historical in nature. These are the Arizona Rangers. They were established in 1901 and disbanded in 1909, so they were only around for about 8 years. They were reformed back in 1957 as a nonprofit organization, but they have no governmental authority anymore. Originally, they were comprised of a captain, a sergeant, and 12 privates. The force was increased to about 26 men a couple of years later. Many of the Rangers were veterans of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and most of them were badasses. They were skilled shooters, trackers, horsemen. They started out as a covert organization, but became well known enough through publicity and started wearing their badges for everyone to see on the front of their vests. Oh, and they were very well armed. Their mission originally was to deal with lawlessness, which was really widespread in the Southwest. There were rustlers and outlaws, and they also helped the Mexican authorities quell an uprising at the mines that were located in Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. In 1909, the Arizona legislature repealed the act establishing the Rangers. The governor did veto the vote to disband, but the legislature had enough votes to override them because of pressure from county sheriffs and district attorneys in northern Arizona. After they disbanded, many of the 107 men who had served as Rangers remained in law enforcement. An article that William McLeod Rain wrote back in the 1905 edition of Pearson's Magazine, let me read you just a paragraph from that. He said, of the Rangers, the work assigned to these Rangers was arduous and dangerous. For many years, sheriff's officers and vigilantes had found themselves entirely unable to cope with the lawless bands which made their headquarters in the Badlands. But the condition of affairs had grown unendurable. The temerity of the outlaws was not only a scourge to the community, but a menace to the good name of the territory. No man's sheep or cattle were safe from the raids of the organized bands of outlaws who would sweep down on a range, drive away the cattle, reach the mountain fastnesses long before the posse could be organized for pursuit. Raids and murders had become so common that they were scarcely noted. There were a dozen bands of the horse and cattle thieves, at the head of which were such men as Bill Smith, the notorious Augustine Chacon, and the train robber Bert Alvord. Yet within a year of the time of its organization, this little band of Rangers, consisting of a captain, a sergeant, and 12 privates, had practically cleared the territory of hundreds of bad characters. Many of them had paid for their lawlessness with their lives, and the rest had been driven across the line into Mexico. The Rangers are recruited from old cowboys and from the ranks of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. They have to be able to rope and ride anything on four legs, as their horses may be killed, and remounts are at times absolutely necessary. Especially quick work is required in heading fugitives from the border. A crime is reported, the ranger slaps on the saddle and is away. To the credit of the ranger, it may be said that 9 times out of 10, he brings back his man, dead or alive. Now, the modern-day Rangers, which were brought back and reformed in 1957, they are an unpaid, all-volunteer law enforcement support and assistance civilian nonprofit organization in Arizona. They work in cooperation with and at the request of and under the control of established law enforcement officials and officers. However, the men that I'm painting today are not part of this organization, although most are retired law enforcement. They just do this because they get a kick out of it. They're amateur historians, and they love to keep the history of the West alive. And I thank goodness that they're out there. I really do appreciate them being willing to take the time and do a photo shoot with me and help to try and tell the story of some of the brave men who helped to tame the American Western frontier so that it was a place of laws and not lawlessness. They made it a safer place for people to come and live. And so back to the painting. I finished up for now the guy in the background, and I didn't want to completely finish him because I needed to get the guy in the foreground finished. That way, that will let me know how much detail I need to put in that the figure in the background there. So I start by putting in his shirt and warms and cools. I don't just want one color, even though by the time we're done with this, it's gonna pretty much look like a blue shirt. But I like having that warm and cool interplay like I told you about. About this time I realized that I did not get the gun in for the back guy, so I did want to go back and put that in there. That's going to help to give me a little better read on how he sits back there. So put that in. Then I'm going to turn his shirt just a little bit. Even, very light shirt with a very dark vest, you need to keep the values relatively close if they're both in shadow. And so I needed to go back in and darken up that white shirt. It looks blue here, but since it's in shadow, there's one little part there that's being hit by the sun. And so to turn that edge, I give it a little more of a dark edge where the light turns into the shadow side. Now when that dries, it won't dry nearly as dark and will sit down where it needs to be. But I do have to darken that area up back there in order for it to read right. Just make sure you're looking at your reference to see how dark it should be as compared to other areas. You'll be fine. Know when you're doing this that you're going to be layering things. So now I'm getting to the part, his vest. This is kind of the part in my head. There's 2 areas that are going to kind of make or break this painting. One is the face of the main shooter, and the other is this broad expanse of his vest. Getting an area like that to read quickly and not be too noodly, not have too much detail and too much going on, because it's not that important of an area, but it needs to read like it's got wrinkles in it. One thing I've learned as I've painted a lot of outfits is that I need to look at the clothing that he's wearing and figure out which are the important folds or wrinkles and which are just there complicating things. because you want to simplify things enough so that it reads like what it is, but at the same time, don't get lost in those details. So decide which 3 or 4 or 5 different wrinkles or folds in the fabric are descriptive folds, and put those in. Don't worry about the other ones. Those will either not be needed or you can add them in later. But the trick to something like this is that it's dark enough back there that you want it to read as one big shape, but you need to have enough of a difference in the value so that you can tell what's going on back there. And that comes with a little bit of experience. As you work more and more with watercolor, you'll find, oh, well, that's not quite dark enough. I need to go back in and reinforce that. And that's fine. I like to try and get her done on the first try, but if it doesn't, I know that I can go in and make adjustments. To me, that's what painting is making those adjustments as you go along, but being able to see them is a big part of that. Since this vest is so dark, I know that it's going to take me a few passes, but I lay in the big folds or the big wrinkles that I know are going to need to be there, and then I can bring everything else up around it. Just take your time, be patient. It'll all come together. You don't have to hurry to try and get this done. Step back and take a look at it, let it dry so that everything is the proper value, and you're not guessing as to how dark something's going to dry. And now for the next fun part, the very intense coloring of his face. I don't have the vest and the shirt finished. I'm kind of bringing them up all together. That way you don't end up with one area that has a lot more detail than maybe you want it to have in the end. If you bring them all up together, you have a better chance of being successful in putting your eye where you want it to be. And so don't feel like you have to finish any one area and then move on to the next. Just kind of try and do them in steps, little baby steps, especially when we're talking about watercolor. It's maybe a little bit different for oils, but with this, you shadowing and the intensity of the colors, everything. So just lay it in there, let it dry in between, so that you know where its real value is, and then you decide where you go from there. Just like in the other faces, this is where you rely on your reference. You want to make sure that you get the values as compared to the other values as close to where they should be as possible. Don't just kind of try and guess it. Keep your reference where you can see it and refer back to it often. Before I go in and start adding any details with gouache, I make sure that I get everything covered. The most important thing to me right now is getting this face correct and making sure that he looks as powerful as I can. The thing that I really like about this gentleman's face is that he's just so concentrating on what he's doing, and I'm going to make sure that I really punch up the color in his face. You know, it's in shadow, and as I've talked about before, I like to make sure that the faces that are in shadow have enough color in them, because otherwise they just kind of die. You can really force your colors on a face that's in shadow and know that it's not going to look terrible. You know, it's going to look pretty good. Just as I'm going along, I'm trying to cover all of the areas that have not been covered yet. Here's a little tip for you when it comes to straight edges. Don't try and do straight lines with just freehand them. Try and use some kind of a straight edge. You're going to be much happier with the results. Right now, just about everything is covered. The spyglass has not been covered. But now I start to go in and do some detailing with my gouache. I can smooth things out and put in reflected lights and really intensify folds in fabric just about anything that I need to add detail to, that's when you break out the gouache. This is the part really where the painting starts coming alive, when you start adding those details in, getting the color relationships exactly right, and putting in just the right amount of details where you want them, cleaning things up. That's a big part of it. And of course, putting some highlights on the tree with the leaves that are catching the light. It's a good idea. You don't have to do a whole lot of them, and you want to keep the values pretty close. If you find that you're struggling with trees, it's possible that you're putting in too many values. You want to keep your tree values pretty close in the sunlight and pretty close in the shadows. If you do that and minimize the amount of details you put in, you're going to be okay. This is also the time that I put in reflected light, like on the bottom of his shirt sleeve there. There's some light bouncing up from the rocks below. You put that in, and that adds a lot to the feeling of this really blinding hot sun coming down and bouncing all over the place. You want to clean up around areas that maybe have bled out. I put a little bit of smoke in and just a little bit of white highlights on the rocks, which will dry and kind of knock back a little bit. But I like to take off the tape and look over everything and make sure that it looks good. Sometimes I'll turn the painting upside down to make sure that the values sit where they need to, and really have a critical eye. If you have too much detail in, knock some of it back. The golden rule for me is never accept anything in my art that I wouldn't accept in someone else's. Be honest with yourself about what you've done and what the flaws are. That's the only way you're going to get better. This is the final painting. This is color corrected and pretty close to how the original looked. I did this painting for the Phippen Western Art Show and Sale as my competition piece in the watercolor division, and luckily I was awarded with a second place in watercolors, and these are the wonderful collectors who decided that they were going to take it home. Well, it's time to close up shop, turn off the lights, and pack it in for another day. As always, I appreciate you showing up. If you like what you saw, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. Hit that notification bell if this is the kind of video that you like and the kind of content. I do try and upload every week or so. It's been a little while since my last upload because I've had a lot of shows that I needed to travel to. Anyways, thank you all for showing up, and as always, I'll see you down the road.